The house was completely quiet when I heard the door. Not the front door, not the back door. The small sound of a bedroom door opening down the hallway, the specific creak that the third floorboard makes when weight shifts onto it in a particular way. A sound I had memorized over 30 years of living in that house, the way you memorize the sounds of a place you have inhabited long enough that its silences become as familiar as its voices. It was 3 in the morning. I had been lying awake the way I had been lying awake most nights for the preceding 4 months, not from pain or illness, but from the particular sleeplessness that comes when something is wrong in your life and your mind refuses to stop turning it over even when the rest of you has run out of energy to engage with it. I heard the footsteps in the hallway, small footsteps, careful footsteps, the footsteps of someone trying very hard not to make any sound at all. Then I heard them stop outside my door. There was a long pause, maybe 30 seconds, that felt like someone standing on the other side of a decision. Then I heard the softest possible sound, the sound of paper sliding across hardwood, and then the footsteps again, retreating, careful, back down the hall, the third floorboard, the bedroom door. I lay still for a moment, then I reached down and picked up the folded piece of paper that was lying just inside my door. I turned on the small lamp on the nightstand. I unfolded the paper. My grandson Eli was 11 years old, and he had written 7 sentences in pencil in the careful handwriting of a child who had been told that handwriting matters and who believed the people who told him. I read those 7 sentences twice. Then I got up, went to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and took out a folder I had been keeping for 4 months that I had not yet decided what to do with. I sat at that desk until the sun came up. By the time the light changed in the window, I had decided. My name is Dorothy Calloway. I am 68 years old. I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, the eldest daughter of a Baptist minister and a woman who taught 4th grade for 31 years, and who approached the education of other people's children with the same seriousness and the same love that she brought to the raising of her own 3 daughters, which is to say completely and without reservation. I grew up in a house where education was not a ladder to something else but a value in itself, where books were on every surface and dinner conversation was expected to contain ideas, and where the question, "What did you learn today?" was asked every evening with genuine curiosity rather than parental obligation. I carried all of that with me. I earned a degree in social work, spent 8 years in child protective services in Birmingham, then another 22 years in family services administration, eventually overseeing a regional department with a staff of 41 and a caseload that required the management of complexity and crisis and the particular human weight of situations where children's well-being was the central concern. I retired at 62. I had been married to my husband Robert for 34 years when he passed from a heart attack in 2017. We had one daughter, Marissa, who was born in 1984 and who is now 40 and who is the reason I am telling this story, though not in the way that a mother hopes to be telling a story about her daughter. Robert was a high school mathematics teacher for 31 years and a man of such consistent and uncomplicated decency that I have spent 7 years since his death trying to find words adequate to describe him and have not yet succeeded and suspect I will not. He loved Marissa with the particular tenderness that fathers bring to daughters, and Marissa loved him with the whole and uncomplicated love that children have for parents before the world has taught them to subdivide it. When Robert died, Marissa was 33 and living 20 minutes away with her husband Craig and their 2 children, Eli, who was 4 at the time, and his younger sister Maya, who was 2. I watched my daughter grieve her father with an authenticity that I found both painful and reassuring. Painful because grief shared between people who love the same person has a quality of exposure that nothing else replicates. Reassuring because the rawness of it told me that what she felt was real and that the relationship had been everything it appeared to be. In the year after Robert died, I was in my daughter's house frequently. I babysat, I had dinners. I was present in the way that a grandmother with time and proximity and love can be present, which is to say constantly and with gratitude for the access. That year was the last year in which I understood my own situation clearly. Craig Fontaine was not a man I had ever fully trusted, and I want to be honest about that because it is relevant to the sequence of events, and because honesty about the people in our lives is something I owe to the story even when it is uncomfortable. Craig was pleasant on the surface, functional in a social setting, the kind of man who made a good impression on brief acquaintance and a more complicated one on longer exposure. He worked in sales management for a medical device company, traveled frequently, and had a relationship with money that Robert had described once as aspirational in a way that suggested concern underneath the diplomatic framing. He wanted things to look a particular way. He wanted the house and the neighborhood and the cars and the vacations to project a version of success that I was not certain was supported by the actual financial infrastructure beneath it. Marissa had absorbed some of this quality over the years of their marriage, in the way that people absorb the priorities of the people they live with most closely. What had been a daughter who valued experiences and relationships had become, gradually and without any single dramatic moment I could point to, a woman who valued presentation and who measured the quality of situations partly by whether they reflected well on the life she was trying to project. I noted this without knowing what to do with it. Robert would have had a conversation with Marissa about it, gently and directly, in the way he had conversations. I did not have Robert's gift for that kind of directness, and I compensated by watching and waiting and telling myself that marriages have their seasons, and that Marissa was fundamentally the person Robert and I had raised, and that what I was seeing was a phase rather than a direction. I was wrong about that. The conversation that started the 4 months happened on a Saturday afternoon in late September. Marissa had come over alone, without Craig, without the children, which I noted as a staging choice the way I had learned to note staging choices over 22 years of family services work, where the arrangement of people in a room tells you as much as the words they use in it. She sat at my kitchen table and she talked about Craig's company restructuring and the uncertainty it had created, and the mortgage on the house and the children's school tuition, and the general financial pressure of a life that had been constructed at a scale that required both incomes at full capacity to sustain. She talked about all of this with the careful clarity of someone who has organized their thoughts in advance and is delivering them in a sequence designed to lead somewhere specific. I listened. I had spent 30 years listening to people describe situations that were leading somewhere specific, and I knew how to let them arrive without accelerating the arrival. When she finished the setup, she said what she had come to say. She said that she and Craig had been thinking about the house, my house, and whether it made sense for a woman living alone to be in a 4-bedroom house on this amount of land, and that they had been looking at properties and had found something that might suit me very well. A 1-bedroom independent living apartment in a community 20 minutes away that was very highly regarded and that had a wonderful social calendar, and that would free up the equity in my current house in a way that could help the whole family get on more stable footing. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, Marissa, are you asking me to sell my house so that you can use the equity? She said it was more complicated than that. I said, let's make it less complicated. Are you asking me to sell my house? She said she was asking me to consider it. I told her I would consider it. She left an hour later. I went to my desk and I started a folder. The folder was a manila folder, the kind with the reinforced tab, the kind I had used for 30 years in an office where documentation was not a preference but a professional obligation. I labeled it with the date of the kitchen conversation. Over the following 4 months, I added to it every time something happened that I thought was relevant to the full picture of what was occurring in my life. The first edition was a note about the kitchen conversation itself, dated, specific, every point Marissa had made, and in what order and what she had said when I asked the direct question. The second edition was a printout of the Independent Living Community's website, which Marissa emailed me the following week with a note saying she had taken the liberty of getting some information. The community cost $4,200 a month for the basic unit. The third edition was a note about a phone call from Craig 2 weeks after the kitchen conversation, in which Craig called to follow up on what he called my thinking about the transition, a word I noted specifically because transition implied a decision had been made rather than a conversation had been had. The fourth edition was a note about a visit from Marissa and Craig together, a visit at which Craig walked through my house in a way that I recognized from 30 years of home visits in my professional life as the walk of a person assessing a space rather than inhabiting it. He commented on the square footage. He commented on the yard maintenance. He said the bones were good, which is a phrase that real estate people use and that Craig had used with the ease of someone who had used it recently in a professional context. The folder grew. The folder was the thing that kept me from second-guessing what I was observing. Every time I told myself I was reading too much into things, I opened the folder and read what I had written on specific dates in specific detail, and I remembered that I had spent 22 years professionally distinguishing between situations that looked concerning and situations that were concerning, and this one was in the second category. Eli and Maya were the center of everything that made the preceding 4 months bearable and everything that made them most complicated. Eli was 11 by the time of the note, and was a child of particular qualities that I had been observing since his infancy with the pleasure of a grandmother and the trained attention of someone who had spent a career noticing how children carried the emotional weight of their environments. He was quiet in the way that sensitive children are quiet, taking in more than he expressed, processing things internally before they surfaced in behavior or words. He was also, in the 4 months since the kitchen conversation, noticeably more watchful around his parents in my presence, the specific watchfulness of a child who has learned that certain adult conversations have consequences for him and who has started paying attention to the signals that precede those conversations. He looked at me differently than he had looked at me before, not with less love, with more attention, the way people look at things they are afraid of losing. Maya was 7 and less attuned to the undercurrents, still inhabiting the full presence immediacy of early childhood, still moving through rooms without monitoring the emotional temperature before she entered. I was grateful for Maya's obliviousness because it meant there was still one person in the house who treated me like a grandmother rather than a situation. I watched Eli. I watched him watching me. And I wondered what he heard at night in a house where adults had conversations that children were not supposed to hear, but that houses do not actually keep private. I have thought carefully about whether to tell you exactly what the note said, and I have decided to tell you because the specific words matter, and because they were his words, an 11-year-old boy's words written in pencil at 3 in the morning, and they deserve to be in the record exactly as he wrote them. The note said this: Grandma, I heard them talking. They want to sell your house and put you somewhere. Dad said the money would fix everything. Mom said you would understand because you love us. I don't want you to go somewhere. I don't think it's fair. I don't know if this helps, but I thought you should know. Eli, that was all of it, 7 sentences. The handwriting was careful in the way I had noticed it was careful, each letter formed with attention, the period after his name placed with the precision of a child who had been told punctuation matters. I read it twice in the lamplight. Then I folded it and held it in my hands for a moment. Then I got up and went to my desk and opened the bottom drawer and took out the folder. I sat at that desk with the folder open and the note beside it, and I read through every entry I had made over 4 months, while the sky outside my window went from black to gray to the pale specific color that early morning makes before the sun fully arrives. I thought about my daughter. I thought about the woman Robert and I had raised and the woman she had become, and the distance between those two people and whose fault that distance was, and whether fault was even the right frame for what had happened to someone I loved. I thought about Eli and what it had cost him to slide that piece of paper under my door. I thought about what I was going to do. By the time the light changed, I knew. I called Ruth Simmons on Monday morning at 8 o'clock. Ruth had been my closest friend for 37 years, since we had worked together in the Birmingham CPS office in 1987 and had recognized in each other, immediately and without much conversation being required, the particular kind of person who shows up fully and stays. Ruth had retired 3 years before me from a career in family law mediation, and she had the particular combination of legal fluency and human wisdom that comes from spending decades in rooms where the worst and best of families are both on display simultaneously. I told her everything: the kitchen conversation, the folder, the 4 months, the note. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was her professional habit and also her personal one, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Dorothy, do you have an attorney? I told her I had used a general practice attorney for Robert's estate who had retired since. Ruth said, you need someone specific. I am going to give you a name. Her name is Adiz Palmer, and she practices elder law and estate planning, and she is the most precise person I have encountered in 30 years of legal work. Call her today. I called Adiz Palmer's office at 9:15. Her assistant said she had an opening on Wednesday afternoon. I said I would be there. Adiz Palmer was 44 years old, the daughter of Nigerian immigrants, and had the quality of stillness and precision that Ruth had described and that I recognized immediately as the quality of a person who processes information at a high level and is not going to say anything until the processing is complete. I sat across from her on Wednesday afternoon, and I put the folder on the table between us, and I told her the story from the beginning, from the kitchen conversation, through the 4 months of documentation, through the note that was now in the folder with everything else. She read through the folder while I talked, not skimming but reading, each entry, each date, each specific detail. When I finished, she closed the folder and looked at me and said, What do you want, Dorothy? I told her I wanted 3 things. I wanted to protect my home. I wanted to protect my relationship with my grandchildren. And I wanted to make decisions about my own life that reflected my own values and my own intentions rather than my daughter's financial situation. Adiz nodded. She said, all 3 of those are achievable. The first one we can address quickly. The second and third will take more care. Let's start with the house. We worked for 2 hours that afternoon. I left with a list of next steps and an appointment for the following week and the specific feeling of a person who has been carrying something alone for 4 months and has just found someone capable of helping carry it correctly. Over the following 3 months, Adiz and I restructured my affairs with the thoroughness that the situation required and that my professional instincts had always told me was the only kind of thoroughness worth practicing. The house was placed into a revocable living trust in my name with successor trustee provisions that I controlled entirely, and that named Ruth Simmons as my successor trustee, not Marissa, not Craig, not anyone whose financial interests created a conflict with my own. The trust documents were specific about the house, its disposition, the conditions under which it could be sold, and the fact that those conditions were mine to determine and no one else's. Adiz explained that the trust did not make the house inaccessible to me in any way. It remained my home and I remained in full control of it, but it made the casual transfer of that control to another party, without my explicit and documented consent, structurally impossible in a way that would require significant legal effort to challenge. The second element was a comprehensive healthcare directive and durable power of attorney that named Ruth as my agent for both medical and financial decisions if I became incapacitated, not Marissa, Ruth. Adiz asked me if I was certain about this, and I told her that I was, and that certainty had not required much deliberation given the folder that was sitting on the table between us. The third element was my will, which I had not updated since Robert died and which had distributed everything to Marissa as the sole heir. Adiz and I rewrote it from first principles. Marissa remained in the will. She was my daughter and I was her mother, and those facts did not change because of a kitchen conversation. But the structure changed significantly. A portion of the estate was directed into educational trusts for Eli and Maya that bypassed Marissa and Craig entirely and would be accessible to the children at 21 with no parental control over the funds. A portion was directed to the Literacy Foundation that Robert had supported throughout his career because his causes were part of his legacy, and his legacy was not something I was prepared to redirect toward a mortgage. The remainder was distributed in proportions that reflected my actual intentions rather than the assumptions that the previous version had been built on. I want to tell you about the drawer because it is in the title of this story, and because the drawer was its own kind of documentation that preceded the folder by years. The bottom drawer of my desk had been, since Robert died, the place where I kept the things that mattered most in a physical sense. His last birthday card to me, written 2 weeks before his heart attack. A photograph of the four of us, me and Robert and Marissa at age 8, taken at a state park in Alabama on a Sunday afternoon when the light was right and everyone was happy in the uncomplicated way that people are happy before they understand that happiness is not a permanent condition but a visitation. A small notebook in which I had written, in the weeks after Robert died, every memory I could capture before the edges softened, the specific things he had said and done and been that I was afraid of losing to time. The folder had gone into that drawer because I had put it there instinctively, the way you put the things that matter somewhere that has already been established as the place for things that matter. When I opened the drawer at 3 in the morning with Eli's note in my hand, I was not just opening a folder. I was opening the record of everything that was worth protecting. The note went into the drawer beside the photograph and the birthday card and the notebook. It belonged there. It was the document that changed the direction of what happened next, and it deserved to be kept with the other documents that had changed directions. I kept it, I still have it. I want to tell you that I waited until Adiz and I had finished our work before I had the conversation with Marissa. I waited 4 months from the note and 3 months from my first meeting with Adiz. I waited because I have spent a career understanding that the sequence in which things happen determines what outcomes are possible, and that having a difficult conversation before you have prepared for its consequences is a way of making yourself vulnerable to the pressure that difficult conversations generate. When the trust was in place and the will was revised and the power of attorney was established and Ruth had signed the documents she needed to sign and Adiz had the complete file, then I called Marissa. I asked her to come over alone. She came on a Saturday morning. She sat at the kitchen table where the first conversation had happened, and I sat across from her, and I told her that I wanted to have an honest conversation about the preceding 8 months. She said okay with the carefulness of a woman who was not sure what was coming. I told her about the folder. Not about the note, not yet, but about the 4 months of documentation and what it contained, and what it had told me about the direction things had been moving. I told her about Adiz and the trust and the will revision and the power of attorney. I told her that the house was protected and would remain so, and that her name was not on any document that gave her or Craig authority over my home or my finances or my medical decisions. I told her that her children had educational trusts in their names that would take care of them regardless of what happened between the adults in this family. I watched her face through all of this. She went through several expressions. Then she was still, then she said quietly, "Mom, who told you?" I said, "Does it matter?" She said, "It matters to me." I said, "What matters to me is whether we can have an honest conversation about what has been happening and what we are both going to do differently." She looked at the table for a long moment. Then she said, Craig pushed hard for this, harder than I was comfortable with. I should have told you that from the beginning. I said, yes, you should have. We sat with that for a while. The conversation that followed was the most honest conversation Marissa and I had had in years, possibly since Robert died, possibly longer. She told me about the financial situation in specific terms she had not used in the kitchen conversation 8 months earlier. The mortgage, the credit, the school tuition, the way Craig's confidence about his income had preceded his income's ability to support the life that confidence had built. She told me that Craig had proposed the plan about my house as a solution with the certainty he brought to everything, and that she had found it harder than she should have to push back on his certainty, because pushing back on Craig's certainty was something she had been losing the energy for over time. She said she knew when she sat at my kitchen table the first time that she was not fully representing her own position, and that she had felt ashamed of that while she was doing it, and had not stopped doing it anyway because she had not known how to stop. I told her that what she had just described was important information about her marriage, and that I was not the right person to tell her what to do with it, but that I was her mother and I was not going anywhere, and that whatever she needed to think through, she could think through with me if she wanted to. She said, I don't know what I want to do about Craig. I said, you don't have to know today. We had coffee. She stayed for 3 hours. When she left, she hugged me at the door in a way that she had not hugged me in a long time, a way that had the quality of something being acknowledged that had not been acknowledged before. I did not tell Marissa about the note in that conversation. I did not tell her in the weeks that followed either. I had thought carefully about this question, about whether Eli deserved to be protected from the consequence of what he had done, and I had concluded that an 11-year-old who slides a piece of paper under his grandmother's door at 3 in the morning because he is trying to protect her has done something that should not cost him anything. Not a conversation with his parents, not a confrontation, not any version of being held accountable for an act of loyalty that was, in its way, one of the most decent things anyone had done for me in 8 months. I handled it differently. I asked Marissa whether Eli and I could have a Saturday, just the two of us, the way we had had Saturdays when he was younger before everyone got busy in the way that families get busy as children age. She said, of course. On that Saturday, I took Eli to the hardware store and we bought supplies for a small woodworking project I had been meaning to do for 2 years, a simple bookshelf for the study that I had sketched out the dimensions for and never built. We spent the afternoon building it together, just the two of us, in the garage with the door open and the afternoon light coming in. At some point, while we were sanding the edges, I said, without looking at him, Eli, I want you to know that I am not going anywhere. The house is taken care of, everything is fine. He kept sanding. He did not respond immediately. Then he said quietly, okay, Grandma, we finished the shelf. It is in my study. It is the best piece of furniture in the house. Ruth came over for dinner the weekend after the trust was finalized, and after the conversation with Marissa, and I told her the full story, including the parts I had not told her in pieces over the preceding months. She listened the way she always listens, completely and without performing the listening, and when I finished she poured more wine into both our glasses and she said, Dorothy, do you know what Robert would say? I said I had some idea. She said he would say you handled this exactly right and then he would make a joke about the bookshelf. I laughed. Ruth laughed. We sat in the kitchen for another 2 hours talking about Robert and about the years in the office and about Eli and the note and about Marissa and what might happen next. Before she left, Ruth said, the note is the part of this story I keep coming back to. I said I did too. She said, an 11-year-old boy at 3 in the morning, worried about his grandmother. Writing it down in his best handwriting. I said, he put a period after his name. Ruth looked at me. She said, his grandfather would have done the same thing. I did not respond to that. I did not need to. She was right, and we both knew it, and some truths are better held in quiet than confirmed out loud. It has been 14 months since the night of the note. The house is still mine, protected by a trust structure that Adiz reviews annually and that I understand completely, and that reflects my intentions precisely. The educational trusts for Eli and Maya are funded and growing. My will reflects who I actually am and what I actually believe rather than who I hoped things would be. Ruth is my power of attorney and my successor trustee and has copies of every relevant document in a fireproof box in her home office. Marissa and I are in a different place than we were a year ago. Not a repaired place, not a return to what it was place, a different place, which is the most honest description I can give. The honesty that came out of that Saturday kitchen conversation opened something between us that had been closed for years and that I did not fully understand had been closed until it opened. We have dinner once a week. We talk about real things. She and Craig are in couples counseling, which she told me about with the specific vulnerability of someone sharing something they are not sure will be received well, and I received it well because I am her mother, and because whatever she needs to work through is worth working through, and I am not going to make it harder for her to do it. Craig is cordial with me in the careful way of a man who understands that a situation he thought he was managing had more variables than he accounted for. I am cordial in return. Eli built a birdhouse last spring in my garage on a Saturday afternoon, a more ambitious project than the bookshelf, and I have it on the back porch where it catches the morning light and where I can see it from the kitchen window when I make coffee. I spent 22 years in family services and 34 years as a mother and 7 years as a grandmother, and the note that Eli slid under my door at 3 in the morning taught me something that all of those years together had not taught me as clearly. It taught me that children know. Not everything, not the details, not the adult complexity of financial arrangements and family dynamics and the slow erosion of trust between people who should know better, but the essential thing. The essential thing children know. They know when someone they love is at risk. They know when the adults around them are not protecting what should be protected. They know when something is wrong even when every adult in the situation is performing the version where nothing is wrong. Eli knew he knew before I had fully allowed myself to know. And he did the thing that the child version of a decent person does when they know something important. He wrote it down in his best handwriting. He put a period after his name. He slid it under the door in the dark and went back to bed and waited. I think about that often. I think about what it cost him and what it required of him and what kind of man he is going to be. I think he is going to be the kind who writes things down when they matter and who shows up when it counts, and who puts a period at the end because he was told that punctuation matters and he believed it. He reminds me of his grandfather. I have told him this. He does not yet fully understand what it means, and someday he will, and I hope I am there when he does. I want to say something directly to the people watching this who are in situations that look like mine looked before the note arrived, who are feeling something is wrong but are talking themselves out of it because the people doing the wrong things are people they love, who are watching and waiting and giving the benefit of the doubt past the point where the doubt deserves a benefit, who are in the position of a woman sitting in a house full of things that matter with a folder in a drawer that is getting thicker while she tells herself she is reading too much into things. You are probably not reading too much into things. The folder is telling you something. The things you are noticing are worth noticing. The sequence of conversations that seem designed to lead somewhere specific is leading somewhere specific. I know what it costs to accept that about people you love. I know it costs something that does not go away quickly even when you handle the situation correctly. I am not telling you it does not cost. I am telling you that the cost of acting on what you know is smaller than the cost of waiting until someone else acts on your behalf and calls it love. Start the folder, call the attorney, talk to the person you trust most who has no financial interest in your affairs. Do it before you need to, do it now. The note may not come to you the way it came to me. Most of the time it does not come at all. Most of the time you have to be your own Eli. You have to be the one who writes it down in the dark and slides it under your own door and trusts yourself enough to open it. My name is Dorothy Calloway. I am 68 years old. I grew up in Birmingham in a house where education was a value and dinner conversation was expected to contain ideas, and what you learned today was a genuine question and not a formality. I spent 30 years in child and family services learning to see what families do with the weight they carry and how children absorb what adults think they are hiding. I raised a daughter with a man who is the most consistently decent person I have ever known. I sat in my house at 3 in the morning and read 7 sentences written in pencil by an 11-year-old boy who was worried about his grandmother and did not know what else to do except write it down. I opened the drawer. I took out the folder. I sat at my desk until the sun came up, and I built something that could not be taken from me, not the house, not the trust documents, not the will, though all of those matter. What I built that could not be taken was clarity. Clarity about who I was and what I had and what it was worth and who deserved to be trusted with it. The note is in the drawer where it belongs, beside Robert's last birthday card and the photograph from the state park and the notebook where I wrote down what I was afraid of forgetting. It is the most important document in that drawer. It was written by a child who loved me enough to get up at 3 in the morning and put something true on paper. I have tried to deserve that. I believe I have. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Every voice in this community matters, and if you have not subscribed yet, please do. There is always more to come.